Brett, you said something about like we can all agree that,
which I should
you know,
not have
healthy.
said. Once I said it, I realized I shouldn't have said that.
Yeah.
But
Well, I'm going after you.
yeah.
So I don't know that we can all agree. People
Getting
So-
back just to one, I know you while you were taking the last word on this, Brett, but
apparently not.
apparently not.
It's tough to do with this
Um,
crowd, let me tell you.
yeah, when I think about
The new Dietary Guidelines for Americans is out, and there's a lot to talk about. So I'm joined by Dr. David Ludwig and by Gary Taubes, who we've had here at Metabolic Mind before. We're going to talk about animal versus plant protein, grains, saturated fat, of course, low carb options, even get into the environment a little bit and how that plays in to dietary healthy recommendations. And are these new dietary guidelines revolutionary? Are they just kind of a little bit more of the same with a tweak? How do we think this? What about implementation? And of course, refined carbohydrates versus ultra-processed foods. We cover a lot. There's a lot of good banter back and forth. I really enjoy discussing these topics with Gary and David. There's a lot we agree on and a lot we sort of disagree on. And hopefully this discussion will help you sort of better internalize what these dietary recommendations can mean for you, for policy, for industry, and of course, for the future and for our health. Well, Gary and David, welcome back to another episode of Metabolic Mind. It's been a little bit, but it's great to have you back.
well, thank you for having us.
Great to be back.
Yeah, so we're in a new year, and we're kicking off the new year with a new dietary guidelines for Americans. So there's a lot to talk about with that. Now, we've been talking about ultra-processed foods and refined carbs and low-carb, high-carb diets. We've been talking about all these concepts for a long time now. And it seems like, if you want to say sort of first blush, broad strokes, this is the first dietary guidelines to really try to address those concepts head on. Maybe dietary guidelines have danced around the edges of carbohydrates and processed foods, but never really addressed it. But these seem to. So let's just jump in and take the first topic of, ultra-processed foods, refined carbohydrates. I guess that's two topics, but what did the guidelines get right? What's different about these guidelines that you think get right? And then let's talk about maybe some of the implementations and where some of the challenges might be. So Gary, what went right? What do you think?
I always like to defer to the Harvard professor.
That's fair.
I think in general, the way I think about this is that for the past, since the original guidelines, they have been LDL cholesterol centric. So what I mean by that is we had a way of thinking about the relationship between diet and disease that emerged out of the idea that saturated fat raises LDL cholesterol. LDL cholesterol is atherogenic. And if we want to prevent heart disease, and which is the number one killer of Americans, then the fundamental aspect of a healthy diet is that it is low in saturated fat, low in fat in general, which is one way to achieve it. And you do that by replacing the products in the diet that are rich in saturated fat, which happen to be animal products, with products which are plant-based carbohydrates. So you end up with, for instance, the iconic food guide pyramid, where the base of the pyramid is grains and starches to be consumed in 8 servings a day. Everything that's come after the original guidelines in 1980 has been based on that paradigm. Okay, keep saturated fat low and then do whatever else is necessary to create a healthy diet around that. Now we've switched to a different way of thinking, which is rather than focusing on LDL cholesterol, we want to keep blood sugar under control. So now we're talking about the epidemic diseases that have emerged in America and around the world over the past half century, which are primarily obesity and type 2 diabetes and their related diseases. And those are diseases characterized by insulin resistance, poor blood sugar control, and now you're focusing on that. It's not a surprise that the sort of architect of the guidelines in RFK Jr.'s Health and Human Services Department, Callie Means, co-authored a book with his sister Casey Means called Good Energy, because we're looking at good energy, which tends to be dietary fats rather than carbohydrates. And now you shift the guidelines to this blood sugar related paradigm, and you end up inverting the food pyramid, which is what we have in front of us.
Well, I think, before we get to David, I think that's a really interesting point that you made because I'm trying to think the prior guidelines, I would assume probably don't mention LDL explicitly, but I think you're absolutely right that the paradigm that set up what they are recommending was fully rooted in the desire to lower LDL. So I think that was an interesting way to say it, whereas now it's more rooted in metabolic health, which is, I think, a really important distinction. And thus for the different approaches, right? So David, what are your thoughts?
So I think the guidelines, the new dietary guidelines for Americans could be headlined in two ways. One is um, amazing how many things stayed the same, or shocking how different it is. And that's just a question of your perspective. So what are the things that stayed this mostly the same that some of my colleagues had feared would change, which is first the limit of 10% unsaturated fat, although as we'll talk about, there's a little internal tension there with some other aspects of the guidelines. Um, Seed oils, which are a major source of omega-6 fatty acids, were not identified as public health enemy number one. In fact, there was very little said about them, and there was concern among the nutrition community that they would be demonized. And there's also explicit promotion of fruits and vegetables, as there has been for many, many decades. The modest change has been a sharpened, focus on processed carbohydrates. In the past, the recent guidelines have identified sugar as an issue, but allowed some wiggle room, like up to 10%. There was one guideline that had discretionary calories. I remember, I love that concept. You could bury some sugar into your pyramid through the discretionary calorie path. And these guidelines are blatant in that sugar is unhealthful and it is not recommended for any child less than age 11. Now, some people are raising alarms and saying that means no trick or treating and nobody can have a birthday cake until they're age 12. That's not the case. I mean, we can still have treats, but the guidelines are there to establish what is healthful. And I think that the clarity there, that no amount of sugar is optimal, added sugar, is an important message. There's also a focus on other processed carbohydrates.
Right. And I think looking at it from the lens for me of what my kids are getting at school for like a school lunch or school breakfast is sort of the perfect lens. Like, sure, they're still going to go trick or treating, they're still going to, go to birthday parties, but for, a publicly funded school to provide a lunch that is high in sugar and high in refined carbohydrates and have an endorsement by the DGA directly or indirectly seems ridiculous. Like, how could we have let that happen? So that seems like a huge step forward from my standpoint.
Yeah, and I especially liked that the term, and you won't be surprised by this because I've been writing about it all year, that the term ultra processed food was not used. I mean, it was present, I think, almost 100 times in the original Make America Healthy Again childhood obesity report. But that as people started to look at the specifics in the process of defining it for public health recommendation, they realized we have no idea how to do this. I mean, to the point that the FDA over the summer came out with a public request for information for help in defining it. Now, we're 16 years after this notion, ultra processed foods, was first proposed. And we still don't know how to define it. So I'm very happy to see that it was not used, because the last thing we want in public health guidelines is imprecision. It's like you think of that analogy of the archer sending arrows at a target. In this case, these are very expensive arrows. Public health interventions are very expensive. And if you're imprecise, you miss the target, and sometimes you hit a innocent passerby and cause harm, and of course waste a lot of effort. So instead of using the term ultra processed, they used a term that makes me will make me sleep well this month, which is highly processed carbohydrates. That is the specific problem. Now that we have trans fats out of the food supply, highly processed carbohydrates, I think, are public health problems 1, 2, and 3. Sugar, highly processed grains, and potato products. Um, so that's great. Now, the big change, which is giving some of my colleagues down the road and around the country indigestion, is the shift from progressively increasing focus on plant-based diets to a warm embrace of animal products as part of a healthful diet. And
So let me hit pause on
yeah,
that for a second, because that is a huge topic that I want to get into. But I love that you brought up the highly processed grains, the highly processed carbohydrate food. So Gary, let me turn to you for a second though. Do you think the individual is going to resonate with a highly processed carbohydrate and know what that is and know what to restrict? How do you see that translating?
I think over the decades, one of my learning experiences is that I have no idea how a lot of people understand nutrition science. What's interesting is authorities who guided us on these new food guidelines clearly thought the same, because they're basically saying you're using phrases like whole foods, real food, avoid the middle aisles of the supermarket, anything that's packaged or is a packaged food product, which is part of what the ultra processed food consumption was trying to get to, but in this case, um, in a much more simplistic, easy to understand way. I mean, I recently had a conversation with two classmates of mine from Harvard, and they didn't understand how to read food labels, what it meant by added sugars, what it meant by the carbohydrate content. So again, I think on some level, a lot of our conversation is theoretical. We don't actually know what the practical applications are. But if it gets translated to, refined grains and starches, and the messages, don't eat white bread, eat rye bread. My mother thought in the 1960s wouldn't feed us white bread because to her that was clearly a deleterious food, and yet all the kids on my street grew up eating white bread.
And one thing that's interesting about sort of some of the pushback or the controversy that I've seen, at least, is saying, well, you're going towards whole foods and no, lowering refined carbohydrates. People can't do that, right? That's just not practical for a lot of people, which you can debate whether these are, guidance and the practicality follows, or we need to give a practical guidance. But I guess the roundabout way of saying it also sort of opens the door to saying, okay, we can have some packaged and processed foods that are low in refined carbohydrates and maybe will then be easily accessible and not detrimental to people's health. So do you see that as an option?
and this is especially true for vegans. There are only so many soybeans you're going to eat, but tofu is a very convenient, high protein, more easily assimilatable food that serves an important role for vegans if they're to avoid protein deficiency. And the same with the plant-based meat alternatives. Most of these are ultra processed, but serve a useful role for vegans. And that's why, virtually without exception, the vegan community is one of my consistent allies in the battle against this indiscriminate use of the word ultra processed.
And Gary, so what about this concept of, this is recommendations for what the government feels is a healthy diet. Does it matter if people say, well, people can't do that? It's not practical.
Well, again, everybody has a different conception of what practical is. And I don't understand why this would be any less practical than the former guidelines. It's just, I mean, there people joke about inverting the food pyramid. If you actually start thinking about the details, so if you put refined grains and starches at the very bottom and animal products at the top, as the new pyramid has it, then that means you're getting very few calories from carbohydrates, particularly refined carbohydrates. For the most part, any carbohydrates, we could push for fruits and vegetables, which are at the top, green vegetables, but the green vegetables don't have a lot of digestible calories in them. So you have to replace the calories you were getting, the 50% of the calories that we were supposedly getting from carbohydrates, with fat or protein. One of the reasons why animal products become an obvious substitute is because animal products, dairy not included, the constituents of our bodies are fat and protein. We have a very tiny carbohydrate content. So if you eat animal products, you are getting fat and protein instead of carbs. If people are averse to doing that, and we've been telling people for 50 odd years that they should be averse to eating a lot of fats and proteins, that's a practical barrier that people have to get over. But then the question is also, are they giving us the healthiest possible diet, or are we just getting a variation of what a healthy diet is? So David's vegan, vegetarian allies, who I would like to think are mine as well, but I'm less certain about it.
Don't get your hopes up.
For them,
When the New York Times magazine with the steak and the butter came out in 2001, I think,
That door was
you
closed.
lost your hope with the vegans.
Yeah, that is quite locked away. But it's been like a quarter of a century, guys. I mean,
They have a long memory.
Forgive and forget.
one hopes. But again, the practicality of eating that way, the expense of eating that way, we would argue that the expense of eating a carb-poor diet, if it exists, is going to be balanced by savings in medical bills. But yeah, who knows if we're right.
David, as you mentioned, it is affecting some of your colleagues. You said it's giving your colleagues heartburn that now they're actually mentioning animal-based proteins and increasing the recommended amount of protein. So give us a little bit of your thoughts there.
Right. Well, so let's think of the main constituents of that ribeye in the left-hand base corner of the pyramid. So, it's, if you're eating a ribeye for dinner most nights of the week, and it's not a 3 or 4 ounce portion, you're almost invariably going to be over 10% saturated fat. So ribeyes, the fat of a ribeye is about 40% saturated fat. The fat of dairy is about 60% saturated fat. Dairy isn't all saturated, but it's a lot of it. So one is going to be over saturated to the 10% level if you're following an animal-based diet. You're also going to get a lot of cholesterol, and you're getting heme iron. So these, and I'm, this will be an area of disagreement with Gary potentially. I'm pretty convinced that high intakes of saturated fat and also heme iron and a lot of cholesterol on a standard high carbohydrate diet is unhealthful. The combination of bread and butter is not good. But there's an interaction. So let me just take a moment to walk through the mechanisms here. When you're eating a high carbohydrate diet, your insulin goes up. If you're eating a high carb diet, the saturated fat in your bloodstream goes up. But as carbohydrate comes down, the saturated fat has a lesser and lesser impact. And then when you get down to a very low carbohydrate or ketogenic diet, you can eat massive amounts of saturated fat, like 30% of calories. That would be a standard dietitian's nightmare. So as there's an interaction on a low carbohydrate diet, the saturated fat you eat, even in large amounts, doesn't build up in the bloodstream. But when it does build up on a high carbohydrate diet, that's a problem. Saturated fat, especially palmitic acid, and like the C12s to C16s, they're not all the same. They have clearly adverse metabolic effects. They're inflammatory. They promote insulin resistance. So I think that one way of integrating this whole thing is that, the conventional notion that saturated fat is unhealthful is correct for a prevailing population. But all bets are off when you focus on reducing processed carbohydrates, and especially when you get down to the very low carbohydrate range, then you enter this highly lipolytic state. You're burning fat very quickly. The ketones that you make are anti-inflammatory, and I think these products, the saturated fat, the cholesterol, in the diet and the heme iron become relatively benign. We have to keep in mind that one size doesn't fit all, and that the amount of carbohydrates we're eating is influencing how those saturated fats affect our metabolism.
Right. So it comes down to interpretation again, because if the interpretation is, well, everybody's just going to keep eating a high carb diet anyway, so recommending more animal foods is therefore irresponsible. But that's not what they're saying. They're saying to reduce the carbohydrates and consequently increase the animal foods as still part of a healthy diet. Let's move on to another topic, specifically dairy. So this is one that has come up a bit. And I think we can agree that the evidence on dairy being harmful really does not exist for a, dairy without sugar in it, whole fat dairy. I hopefully we can agree on that it really, some studies even show reduced cardiovascular risk and so forth for that. But one thing that came out was, well, a large percentage of the population is lactose intolerant. So how can you recommend dairy without recognizing that? And I've got my sort of takes on that, but I'm curious if you've heard that or what your reaction has been.
I probably shouldn't say this publicly,
Well, here's your
but for
chance,
50
Gary.
years,
Not too late.
we have been, yeah, we have been told to eat beans to excess, and they didn't care whether or not we could digest them without the kind of gastrointestinal issues that could destroy marriages. Okay. And then now that it's dairy, suddenly they care that half the country can't digest that without similar gastrointestinal problems. And I hate to use words like they, because it implies that I'm suddenly lumping a whole group of thinkers together without any nuance or individuality. But in this case, stop telling us to eat legumes if you care about GI issues in a large part of the population. Okay? If you don't care, then we don't care what you have to think about lactose intolerance.
Well said.
And am I wrong about this, doctor? You're the
Well,
David,
all right.
you're
So,
the physician.
and a pediatrician, we know something about milk. I- let's start with the question. Yeah, I think Brett, you said something about like we can all agree that
Which I should
milk
not
is
have said.
healthy.
Once I said it, I realized I shouldn't have said that.
Yeah.
But
Well, I'm going after you.
yeah.
So I don't know that we can all agree. The question is always trade-offs. When you go from the reason I've advocated all my career essentially against low-fat milk is that when you take the fat out, the product is less satisfying. And so like, you take the kid who might come home and have in the 60s a glass of whole milk and 2 cookies. Now you give him a glass of fat-free milk and he has 4 or 5 cookies. That's a bad trade-off. More broadly, what are the foods that are being substituted for the milk when people are not consuming milk? And for the most part, in the United States, they're processed carbohydrates. They're less healthful foods. So I think on the background of an American diet, dairy tends to look healthful. That doesn't mean it will on the background of every diet. And there are some conceptual reasons not to like dairy. It can be inflammatory. There's a lot of people react to certain of the proteins. Then you mentioned the lactose. I don't think the lactose is an overriding issue because there are all sorts of ways to either reduce it in a product that has lactose or just choose foods that are dairy foods that are inherently very low in lactose. Hard cheeses have virtually none. And then lastly, there's the environmental issues about both dairy and meat. If everybody consumed 3 servings of dairy a day, I mean, first of all, we would need vastly more dairy cows than we have because we can't supply that. People are now consuming, on average, less than half of that across the population. So it's more than a doubling. And, this going to have massive impacts on the farm structure and the environment. And we do need to consider environmental impacts, which is a whole nother issue.
Yes, but do we need to consider that, right? Do we need to consider that in designing what is a healthy diet for human beings to consume? Or do we say this is the diet to consume, and then we're going to figure out how to do that in an environmentally friendly, climate friendly way?
Well,
But that
yeah.
does
So
not
I think
influence what's healthy for us.
that's the debate. And I would say, there are people who say we should just fully look at the what's optimal health and then figure the rest out. There are others saying how, if you've got an unsustainable diet, then it's going to be unhealthy for everybody. What's the point? I think that when you had maybe a maximum of 50 million to 100 million hunter gatherers in the world, everybody could be eating meat every day. But now that we have approaching 10 billion humans, we can't everybody can't be, even if we get the perfect integrative regenerative agricultural systems where the cows are not being, fed grains, which we all recognize is the worst of the worst situation. To raise grains in industrial agriculture and then feed them to animals to eat, that's not sustainable. So I'm convinced there's a role for, we need grazing animals to fertilize soils. This is why soils have been so rich around the world. You have grazing animals eating it, defecating, and then the microbiome and the habitat. So there's ways to do that. We don't have to eliminate meat or dairy, but I don't see how we can be recommending expecting that people can have 3 servings of steak a day and 3 servings of dairy a day and, not, you know, recognize that there's no way to solve that problem. There's no way that that can be sustainable.
One issue here and this gets back to our Southeast Asian populations who are metabolically healthy on high carbohydrate diets. Clearly, the world is full of people who were healthy on carb-rich diets, and the world that still has a considerable number of people who are healthy on carbohydrate-rich diets. If we understand what it is that makes them metabolically unhealthy and can remove that, then we can then the need to have a lower carbohydrate, higher animal product rich diet is minimized. And so rather, again, as we focus now on things like ultra processed foods or all calories or eating too much or even sedentary behavior, these are things that are unlikely to be fixed. If it turns out, for instance, that seed oils are the problem, again, I don't find the data compelling, but if it's true, then you remove seed oils, you no longer have metabolically unhealthy people, or they get with each successive generation metabolically more healthy. The need to have protein and fat-rich diets and carb-poor diets get smaller. If it's sugar, that would be nice to know. And then you get sugar out of diets, many more people become metabolically healthy and never have to eat the way, for instance, I eat now, because I feel that it's necessary to maintain a healthy weight and a healthy lifestyle. Had I not spent the first 20 years of my life eating white bread and guzzling Gatorade, perhaps I never would have had to transition, and I'd have a much more conventional diet. I might even have become a vegetarian like my wife because I could do that.
Yeah, but there's another way to integrate this, which is high fat. There are a lot of animal products, plant products that are very high in fat, and that can be produced in conjunction with sustainable animal husbandry practices and a moderate consumption of less processed carbohydrates that for most people will allow for the greatest dietary variety, and oftentimes in physiology, you get 90% of the benefit when you go 50% of the way. I mean, there may be people like Gary who feel like they have to go 90% of the way to be healthy, getting rid of almost all carbohydrates. But for most people, just reducing the processed carbs, substituting it with less processed carbs, whole fruits and vegetables, oils, and moderately more protein will transform public health. And that, I think, provides a middle ground than, we have to be vegan, or we're going to kill the world versus, let's go with the ribeye. Let's bathe in beef tallow, um, which I think is not realistic either.
And I am going to say, I mostly agree with David, but I don't. His use of the word for most people, I think, is something we don't know. If he says many people, I'm in complete agreement. Whether many is most in the world,
Okay, let's change. Let's edit in many people, and let Gary and I
there we go.
have a little love fest here.
Oh, sorry.
All right. So circling back real quick though to environmental concerns, and I'm going to take the host privilege to get the last word on this and then move on. But we also have to consider, all those fields of monocropped grains and soy and so forth are also incredibly unsustainable and unhealthy for the earth. So we can't talk about one without the other.
Right, Brett, that's
And
absolutely right, and that's why industrial, um, you know, CAFO type animal husbandry practices are a nightmare.
But then you have the conflict that actually has a lower greenhouse gas footprint because the animals are, if you'll pardon the horrible expression, harvested far earlier in life because they're fattened and grown so quickly that you don't have to have 3 years of a animal eating and passing gas. You've only got
Too, but
they
1
do
year.
nothing for the soil. They do nothing for the soil.
Yeah, no, I
to where,
completely
and it
agree.
takes
I'm
a
just
whole
saying
lot
there's
of
this
industrial
bizarre
grains to feed.
conflict.
It's very inefficient. Maybe the animal winds up storing as meat and fat calories 5% or 3% of the energy in the grains you feed them.
And so it's a question of what is and what can be done. And you can harken back to sort of like the organic, when organic first started, people said, you can't scale organic. You're not going to have enough organic farms for the people who want to eat organic. And it's scaled quite a bit. And I think you could sort of say that's where we are for regenerative farming, regenerative ranching. Oh, you can't scale it. Well, if we dedicated the resources and attention to it, we probably could. We just have to acknowledge.
There's a lot of land that is unsuitable for agriculture. I mean, I was just watching pictures of this from Scotland. I mean, these hills, you can't farm on those hills, but the sheep happily graze. And I mean, why not? Like, why would we rule that out, as inappropriate when that might be the most environmentally sustainable approach, good for the soil? And then you've got those high quality, those high protein calories that people
Getting back just
benefit
to
from.
one, I know you while you were taking the last word on this, Brett, but
But apparently not.
apparently not.
It's tough to do with this
Um,
crowd, let me tell you.
yeah,
No,
when
no
I think
way.
about this, I discuss it with people and how to me it's these are dietary guidelines. So we often think we have an obligation to future generations of Americans to eat a diet that keeps them healthy. But if you are a mother or a parent of children, your obligation, I believe, your first moral obligation is to feed the healthiest possible diet to your children. And if your children are now predisposed to become obese or diabetic, as an ever increasing number of children seem to be, you have an obligation to them not to care so much about the planet that you feed them a diet that makes them worse because it might prevent climate change. That's how I think about it. I think and as soon as we become parents, our primary moral obligation is to our children and giving them the help.
Well, that certainly does, but that's true, and it's especially true in developing countries where these children are on the brink of multiple micronutrient deficiencies, protein deficiencies. The best thing for them, in vast stretches of Africa, parts of Asia, South America, is access to moderate amounts of animal proteins, animal foods. That is the best thing we can do to save a potentially devastated generation from stunting and malnourishment.
So let's wrap this up though with one more discussion about the dietary guidelines if we can. And actually maybe it'll be a short discussion because it's something we've been talking about for decades, but finally a nod to if someone is metabolically unhealthy and has metabolic dysfunction, then perhaps a low carb diet would be a beneficial intervention, and the guidelines should be open to allowing for that, something that has never been mentioned in prior guidelines. So is it revolutionary? Is it about time? Is it obvious? Like, how do you think we should be responding to this?
I suppose it is revolutionary that they do. What is the phrase they use for certain chronic disorders? Low carbohydrate lifestyle might be appropriate, but they don't actually define certain chronic disorders, which leaves it open because it actually can cover 80% of the, maybe 90% of the population of the country. This gets down to, one of my fundamental issues is always, we've been arguing, like I said, we live in a different nutritional paradigm than conventional nutritionists and the medical community, which is LDL cholesterol centric and calorie centric rather than carbohydrate centric. And these guidelines more represent our thinking than theirs, which is a great thing. But those people, if we're right, which of course is an open question, then those people have to come to think like we do. And I don't believe you get people to think like you do by telling them with dietary guidelines. I think you need to give them evidence that they find compelling, whether or not that evidence could, whether or not they would ever find evidence for an alternative belief system compelling is an open question. But I think the guidelines are mentioning the possible benefits of low carbohydrate diet certainly opens the door. And that's something that and I think everyone is now willing to accept, even as they might differ on why low carbohydrate diets are beneficial.
Well, you asked whether this new recommendation is revolutionary, and I think it is in the technical sense of revolving. We're back to where we started in one sense, a century ago. And so we've been shifting backward with resistance. And now, the new administration and the new paradigm is suddenly embracing this, even though, there's some internal conflicts in the document. The document, as all such ones are political compromises as well as scientific documents. But it's exciting. And I was speaking at a dinner recently, Gary attended, when I said, I spent all my career arguing for things that the government kept saying were wrong. And now the government is saying the same thing. And I feel like I've got an identity crisis. Like, how will I ever, who am I if not a heretic anymore? So I don't think that the paradigm is fully shifted, but at least there's a
I
window
don't think
that's
we have
open.
to worry, David.
Yeah, I think that there's a window opening, and now I think an obvious thing to do. We've had dozens of multi-million dollar low-fat diet trials. They're basically all failures, like the Look Ahead trial, which was a low-fat diet to prevent heart disease in diabetes. It closed early for futility. We've never had a single NIH-sponsored multi-center trial of that magnitude to see if a low-carb diet could reduce heart disease and diabetes. I mean, this takes, you need thousands of participants, a budget of tens of millions of dollars. This has never been funded. Maybe today,
Yeah, I think
this
that's a
can.
really important point to make too, that it's not just influencing how we eat, it's influencing what is studied and what is researched and what is funded, at least indirectly. And also that the guidelines aren't saying everybody has to be low carb, everybody has to be keto, but it says this is an option, which I can't believe would be controversial, but yet still somehow is controversial.
Yeah, I mean, everybody doesn't have to be keto. I mean, that's really quite clearly the case. But there are people who seem, if you've got diabetes, in my view, and I'm going to speak confidently for Gary as well, if you have diabetes, a low carbohydrate and ideally a ketogenic diet is the default option.
All right,
Should
gentlemen.
be.
Well, this has been a wonderful discussion and exploration of the new dietary guidelines. I want to thank you both very much for joining and helping with the discussion. And I hope we can do it again very soon. So thank you both.
Great.
Okay. Thank you, guys. Thanks, Bret.
Thank you for watching. If you want to see more, check out these recommended videos. Also, if you haven't already, don't forget to subscribe to our channel to stay up to date with our content and help us expand the movement. And if you want to sign up for our newsletter, access our resources, read the latest research, or check out the Think Smart framework, click here to visit our website. See you on the next video.